Welcome back to That Stitch-tastic. My name is Angela, and I am a knitting instructor as well as your yarn craft cheerleader. And this video is a continuation of the series of videos to accompany the 2 at a time sock knitting workshop. Now, whether you are taking the workshop in person in class or through the online workshop that I am offering, I just want to thank you so much for joining us again. These videos are here to help you by showing you the techniques and a couple of tricks to help you successfully complete a pair of socks knit 2 at a time. In this video, we will be talking about the cast-on, or one of the cast-ons. In this workshop, there are 2 cast-ons that we will be covering. The one is the long tail cast-on, and the second one is the double start cast-on or the stretchy Estonian cast-on. But in this video, we will be covering the long tail cast-on in depth. And the reason why is the long tail cast-on is a great cast-on to be used for a top-down sock because it gives a really nice firm edge, which is great. What we need, because our sock needs a good foundation for us to knit on as we knit from the top down. But we also need it to be very flexible and elastic, so it is stretchy enough to fit over our heel, over our ankle, and up onto our calf, and fit the leg of our leg comfortably without being too binding. Now I know what you're thinking. The long tail cast on? Seriously? I learned long tail cast on when I was learning to knit, and you probably were, but bear with me. It is very common, whether you are a novice knitter or a beginning knitter or a more experienced knitter, to cast on the long tail cast on too tightly. And that is in an attempt to try to get the nice and firm edge we need, whether we're knitting a sock or a sweater or a scarf. And when we do that knitting a scarf or knitting a sock, this can result in our socks being too tight and bind and actually cause them to fall down the leg. So what I want to do is I want to try to cover the long tail cast on in depth and help you understand how the long tail cast on is worked mechanically and how the tail yarn and the working yarn work together in the cast on. So to demonstrate this, I'm using worsted weight yarn of 2 colors. So I have my working yarn is in the green, my tail yarn is in the blue. And we're going to pretend I have measured out the length of yarn I needed for my tail, and I've made my slip knot. And now I'm going to set up. So if you need a refresher, we're going to remember, again, the working yarn goes in the back. The tail yarn goes in the front. And then our index finger and our thumb are simply going to come in and split these 2 strands. The working yarn is going to go over the index finger. The tail yarn is going to go over the thumb. And so it looks like that. And then these 3 fingers here are simply going to wrap around and kind of hug these 2 strands against the palm of your hand. So when you look at it from the top, this is what it looks like when you're set up for the long tail cast on. And then we're going to rotate the palm of our hand so the palm is either facing you or facing forward. So we have our index finger and our thumb, and we're going to take our needle and we're going to go under this strand that's on the thumb, and this is our tail yarn. We're going to go back and we're going to go behind the strand that's on the index finger, and this is the working yarn. And we're going to pull the working yarn through that loop that's on our thumb. We're going to drop it off our thumb and give it a tug to snug it up. Now I'm going to repeat this again 5 more times. And then I'm going to stop and show you something. Now there's actually a rhythm or little rhyme. You can say when making this, it's under, around, through, and drop. And notice it's my thumb that is snugging up the tail yarn. So there we have 6 stitches cast on. Normally we would cast on, we would count this slip knot as a cast on stitch, but for demonstration purposes, we have these 6 cast on stitches. Now I want you to notice how it is the working yarn that is actually forming the stitch on the needle. And the tail yarn is what is giving us the cast on edge. And we can see how these stitches have a nice space. They're nice and evenly spaced for the most part. They have a little gap in between them. And that is done by how snug or how tightly we pull on the cast on the tail yarn during the cast on, the long tail cast on. Now I'm going to demonstrate this. So in order to have a really nice, flexible and elastic cast on edge for the long tail cast on, we want to make sure we have a little bit of a space or a gap in between our stitches. Now, what is very common is sometimes we'll be in a hurry or we are just stressed out that day and we start casting on our long tail cast on and we are really tugging on our tail yarn, trying to make a firmer edge and really making that cast on edge really tight. So you see how I'm really pulling on that tail yarn? And when I do, it is really snugging these stitches up against each other, and it's forming less of a space or less of a gap in between these stitches. Okay. So, and this is actually really common. Whoops, I don't know what I just did there. I was talking, that's what I was doing, instead of paying attention to my cast on. So it's very common to do the long tail cast on too tight, and that happens when you pull on your tail yarn in an effort to really snug these stitches up against each other to make a firmer cast on edge. And so as you can see, these have less of a space or less of a gap than these cast on stitches have here. And when you pull these off, you're going to see, and yes, we're going to drop stitches and that's okay. You're going to see that this cast on edge for these stitches has more flexibility and elasticity than these. Do you see that? You see how there's very little give here. And that is because we, which is common to do, tugged on this tail yarn way too tight when we were making the cast on for the long tail cast on. And when we do that, if we do that when we are casting on for our sock, our cast on edge and our cuff is not going to fit comfortably on our leg. Now I'm going to go one step farther to try to demonstrate this. I've taken this knitting needle and I have marked with a Sharpie every inch, and I apologize, my lines are not perfectly straight, but it's okay. So I'm actually when I am knitting with worsted weight yarn on size 8 needles, which this is what it is, I usually get about 4 or 5, sometimes even 6 stitches per inch, and we can actually cast on to that gauge. So if you're very careful, you can make sure you are casting on to the gauge you need. So say for your sock, if you need 9 stitches per inch for your gauge, you can cast on 9 stitches per inch, and that will help you to ensure you get your gauge. Well, I'm going to cast on it. I'm going to see what happens. So I can usually get 4 or 5 stitches per inch with worsted weight yarn. So here's 1 stitch. And again, I am going to pull on my tail yarn to snug it up, but I am not going to pull too tight. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It looks like with this one, I'm going to get 6 because this is a little bit lighter worsted. So as you can see, I still have a really nice, oh, there's my inch. So looks like I got 5 stitches per the inch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, there's my inch right there. And you can see I've got a really nice even gap or even spacing in between these stitches. Now let's see what happens if I cast on and I am not paying attention and I am really pulling tight. So I'm going to pull tight on these. 1. So here's my inch mark. Here's my first stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you can see how pulling on the tail yarn really does make a difference. The size of my loops are going to stay the same because the working yarn is what forms the loops of the stitch, but it is the tail yarn and how tightly we pull on the tail yarn that is going to determine the spacing of our cast on edge, and it's also going to determine how flexible and elastic our cast on edge is. So again, this is just something to help you be aware of when you are making the long tail cast on, of how we need to be aware to make sure we are keeping our stitches nice and evenly spaced so we have a flexible edge and with elasticity. Thank you for watching. Again, my name is Angela with That Stitch-tastic. The next video I will be showing the long tail cast on with the sock yarn and the sock needle. Have a wonderful evening.